There exists a moment in every human interaction where the scales of power tip in one direction or the other, where respect is either commanded or surrender becomes inevitable. Machiavelli understood this moment with a clarity that borders on the supernatural, recognizing that disrespect is not an insult to be suffered, but a strategic opening to be exploited with surgical precision. Most people, when confronted with contempt or dismissal, retreat into hurt feelings or erupt in reactive anger. Yet the Florentine master saw something entirely different, an opportunity to reshape the entire architecture of a relationship through calculated action that transforms defiance into absolute compliance. What if the very moment someone dares to disrespect you could become the precise instant you establish an unshakable dominion over their future behavior? Not through violence or cruelty, but through a demonstration of power so elegantly devastating that resistance becomes psychologically impossible. The contemporary world celebrates emotional authenticity and immediate reaction, teaching us to express our wounded pride or respond with equivalent hostility when our dignity is challenged. Machiavelli would view this modern impulse as the behavior of those destined to remain powerless, forever trapped in cycles of petty conflicts that diminish their authority with each passing encounter. He observed that princes who reacted emotionally to every slight quickly became predictable, and predictability in matters of power is a fatal vulnerability that invites continued testing and eventual overthrow. The truly formidable leader in Machiavellian philosophy is the one who receives disrespect as a chess master receives an opponent's poorly considered move, with hidden satisfaction, knowing that the other has just revealed their weakness and provided the perfect justification for a response that will forever alter the balance between them. Consider the unsettling reality that those who disrespect you are often testing boundaries, probing for weakness, searching for confirmation that you lack the will or capacity to enforce consequences for their transgression. Machiavelli recognized that such moments are defining crucibles, where your entire future relationship with that individual and with all who witness the interaction will be determined by your response in the following seconds and minutes. Respond with pleading or explanation, and you confirm their assessment of your powerlessness. Respond with emotional outrage, and you reveal that they possess the ability to control your state of mind, but respond with the measured, inevitable demonstration that disrespect carries costs they cannot afford to pay, and you accomplish something far more valuable than winning a single confrontation. You establish a precedent that ripples through all future interactions, creating what Machiavelli would call a lasting impression of severity. The transformation from disrespected to feared does not require physical dominance or resources beyond your current reach. It requires only an understanding of human psychology that Machiavelli articulated with ruthless precision 5 centuries ago. He understood that fear, properly cultivated, is not about terrorizing others, but about ensuring they possess a vivid awareness of consequences, a mental calculation that makes defiance seem infinitely more costly than compliance. This is the secret that separates those who command rooms from those who merely occupy them, those who shape events from those who are shaped by them. When you master the Machiavellian method of converting disrespect into fear, you gain access to a form of social power that operates almost automatically, where others police their own behavior around you, not because you demand it in the moment, but because they have internalized the understanding that crossing you produces outcomes they desperately wish to avoid. What you are about to discover is not a collection of aggressive tactics or theatrical displays of dominance, but rather a sophisticated framework for strategic response that Machiavelli himself employed and counseled in princes and leaders across Renaissance Italy. This is about the precise calibration of consequence, the timing of response, The selection of examples that educate entire populations through the experience of a single individual. By the time this exploration concludes, you will possess a lens through which every act of disrespect becomes not a personal affront, but a strategic opportunity. A moment where you can choose to remain ordinary or to demonstrate the qualities that separate those who are remembered with admiration and anxiety from those who are forgotten the moment they leave a room. The question is not whether you will face disrespect in your life, but whether you will continue to absorb it passively or finally learn to alchemize it into the raw material of unquestionable authority. The foundation of Machiavellian power transformation begins with a principle that contradicts every instinct screaming inside you when someone treats you with contempt. You must never respond immediately to disrespect. Machiavelli observed that immediate reaction, whether defensive or aggressive, reveals that the other person has successfully provoked you, which itself is a form of victory for them and a demonstration of weakness on your part. The prince who can be predictably triggered by insult is a prince who can be controlled, manipulated, and ultimately undermined by anyone clever enough to recognize the pattern. When disrespect occurs, the first Machiavellian move is internal and invisible. You acknowledge what has happened with cold clarity while your exterior remains composed, perhaps even pleasant, creating a dissonance that unsettles the offender far more than any immediate retaliation could achieve. This delay is not cowardice or passive acceptance, but rather the gathering of strategic information and the creation of psychological tension that works in your favor. Machiavelli understood that the person who disrespects you is making assumptions about your character, your resources, and your willingness to enforce consequences. By not responding in the expected manner, you immediately invalidate their assumptions and introduce uncertainty into their mental model of who you are and what you might do. This uncertainty is the beginning of fear, because human beings are far more unsettled by unpredictable threats than by known dangers. The disrespectful individual who receives an unexpectedly calm response begins to question whether they have miscalculated, whether they have inadvertently provoked someone more formidable than they realized, and this doubt plants the first seeds of the psychological transformation you are engineering. During this period of apparent inaction, you are actually conducting a form of strategic reconnaissance that Machiavelli would recognize as essential to effective rule. You observe how the disrespectful person behaves in the aftermath of their transgression. Do they double down, believing they have discovered a weakness they can exploit repeatedly, or do they show signs of nervousness, perhaps offering subtle signals that they are reconsidering their action? You also observe the social environment surrounding the incident, noting who witnessed it, how they reacted, and what implicit expectations exist about how such situations should be resolved. This information becomes the intelligence that shapes your response, ensuring that when you do act, your action is precisely calibrated to produce maximum impact with minimum effort, demonstrating power rather than merely expending energy. The art here is in maintaining perfect composure while your mind operates with ruthless analytical precision, a duality that Machiavelli himself embodied and that he counseled in those who would exercise power effectively. Your face shows nothing, perhaps even continues previous conversation, as though the disrespect were beneath notice. While internally, you are assessing the optimal point of leverage, the exact nature of consequence that will transform this individual's perception of you permanently. Machiavelli recognized that this internal discipline, this capacity to separate emotional response from strategic calculation, is what fundamentally distinguishes those who accumulate power from those who merely react to circumstances. The person who masters this separation gains an almost supernatural advantage in human interactions. because they are playing an entirely different game than everyone around them, operating on a temporal and strategic dimension that others cannot even perceive. Consider what happens in the mind of the person who has shown you disrespect when you respond with unexpected calm or even pleasantness. Initially, they may feel a rush of satisfaction, believing they have dominated the interaction and revealed your weakness. But as time passes and you continue to treat them normally, perhaps even including them in activities or conversations, a different feeling begins to emerge. Confusion, then gradually dawning unease. They realize they cannot predict your response, cannot map your behavior to any familiar pattern. This unpredictability becomes psychologically oppressive because humans are pattern-seeking creatures who become anxious when patterns break down. Without knowing it, the disrespectful person has entered a trap of their own making, where your calm becomes more menacing than any angry response could be, because it suggests depths of calculation and control that they failed to anticipate. Machiavelli would point out that this phase of strategic patience accomplishes multiple objectives simultaneously, each one strengthening your position while weakening theirs. First, it prevents you from taking action in the heat of emotion that you might later regret, or that might reveal more about your capabilities and intentions than is strategically wise. Second, it allows time for the disrespectful act to be observed and remembered by others, creating witnesses whose presence will amplify the impact of your eventual response. Third, it permits you to choose the timing and nature of your response based on strategic advantage rather than reactive impulse, ensuring that when you do act, the conditions favor maximum effectiveness. Fourth, and perhaps most subtly, it begins the psychological destabilization of the offender, who experiences increasing anxiety as they wait for consequences that reason tells them should arrive, but that mysteriously fail to materialize in expected forms. The culmination of this first phase occurs when you have fully assessed the situation and determined the precise form your response will take. A determination guided not by emotional satisfaction, but by strategic calculation about what action will most effectively establish the new power dynamic you intend to create. Machiavelli taught that punishment or consequence should be proportionate not to the offense itself, but to the message you need to send and the behavioral change you need to produce. Sometimes a massive response to a small slight is strategically correct because it establishes that you are not someone to be tested in any manner whatsoever. Other times, a subtle but devastating response to a major disrespect is appropriate because it demonstrates that you possess power so secure that you need not even exert yourself fully to put someone back in their proper place. The key is that your response is chosen deliberately, with clear objectives about the psychological and social outcomes you intend to achieve. Once you have determined your strategic response, the next Machiavellian principle becomes crucial. Your action must be swift, decisive, and disproportionately memorable relative to the original offense. Machiavelli observed that half measures in response to challenges against authority produce worse outcomes than no response at all, because they suggest weakness masquerading as strength and invite further testing. When you finally respond to disrespect, that response must be comprehensive enough that the person experiences a genuine cost, understands exactly why they are experiencing it, and forms a permanent association between disrespecting you and suffering consequences. This does not mean cruelty for its own sake, which Machiavelli would dismiss as the behavior of tyrants who confuse sadism with power, but rather the calculated infliction of a consequence that reshapes the other person's entire understanding of who you are and what challenging you entails. The form this consequence takes will vary depending on context, but certain Machiavellian principles apply universally across all situations. First, The consequence must be public enough that others witness it and learn the lesson vicariously, multiplying the educational value of your response far beyond the single individual who offended you. Machiavelli understood that ruling populations, whether of citizens or colleagues or social circles, is vastly more efficient when examples are made that teach many people simultaneously through the experience of one. When others observe that disrespecting you results in severe and unavoidable consequences, they adjust their behavior preemptively, sparing you the necessity of having to discipline each person individually. This is the economy of fear that Machiavelli described, a single, well-executed response that prevents 1,000 future transgressions. Second, your response must be utterly undeniable in its connection to the original disrespect, leaving no room for the offender or observers to claim it was coincidence, pettiness, or unrelated to the triggering event. Machiavelli emphasized that consequences lose their educational value if people can rationalize them away or fail to understand the causal relationship between action and outcome. Therefore, you must ensure that when you respond, everyone involved, including the offender, clearly understands that this is happening specifically because of the disrespect shown, and that the same fate awaits anyone else who makes the same error. This might mean explicitly stating the connection, or it might mean timing and framing your response so that the causality is obvious without being verbally declared. The goal is to create what Machiavelli would call a lasting impression, where the memory of consequence becomes permanently linked to the memory of transgression. Third, the consequence should ideally strike at something the disrespectful person values more than they valued the satisfaction of disrespecting you, creating a clear cost-benefit analysis in their mind and in the minds of observers. Machiavelli recognized that humans are fundamentally calculating creatures who respond to incentives and disincentives, and that changing behavior requires making the undesired behavior more costly than the temporary satisfaction it provides. If someone disrespects you to look impressive in front of their peers, a response that humiliates them before those same peers creates the exact inverse of their intended outcome, teaching them and everyone watching that disrespecting you achieves the opposite of its intended effect. If someone disrespects you to assert independence or challenge your authority, a response that demonstrates you control resources or opportunities they need reinforces that challenging you is strategically foolish. Consider how Machiavelli himself employed this principle in his political career and in the advice he gave to rulers. He understood that the goal was not to be cruel, but to be effective, not to punish for the sake of punishment, but to restructure future behavior through strategic consequences. When a prince was challenged, Machiavelli advised responses that were severe enough to discourage future challenges, but not so excessive that they created martyrs or unified opposition. The ideal response in his framework is one that isolates the offender, makes them bear the full weight of their poor judgment, and demonstrates to everyone else that cooperation with your authority is vastly preferable to resistance. This calculation applies equally whether you are managing a kingdom, leading a team, or navigating social relationships. The psychological impact of this kind of strategic response is profound and lasting in ways that emotional reactions can never achieve. When you respond to disrespect with calculated consequence rather than emotional outburst, you communicate something deeply unsettling to the offender: that you are not ruled by emotion, that you operate according to principles and strategic calculations that they failed to account for, and that you possess the discipline and patience to wait for the optimal moment to act. This realization is infinitely more fear-inducing than hot anger, because it suggests a quality of mind and character that cannot be easily manipulated or predicted. The person who realizes they have disrespected someone capable of this level of strategic thinking experiences a fundamental recalibration of their assessment, moving you from the category of ordinary people who can be pushed and tested to the category of formidable individuals who must be approached with caution and respect. Machiavelli would emphasize that the execution of your response must appear effortless, almost inevitable, as though consequences naturally flow from disrespect the way night follows day. If your response seems like a struggle, if you appear to exert great effort or emotional energy in delivering it, you diminish its impact because you reveal that you had to work hard to impose your will. But if consequences seem to materialize almost automatically, as though the universe itself enforces respect for you, the psychological impact is exponentially greater. This requires careful staging and presentation of your response, ensuring that whatever action you take appears to cost you nothing while costing the offender significantly. The prince who sentences a traitor to death while barely looking up from dinner, in Machiavelli's observation, creates more lasting fear than the prince who rants and raves about betrayal, because the former suggests power so complete that it requires no emotional investment to exercise. After delivering your strategic response to disrespect, the Machiavellian approach requires something that separates true power from mere vindictiveness. You must return to normal behavior almost immediately, treating the matter as conclusively resolved rather than dwelling on it or holding permanent grudges. Machiavelli observed that rulers who remained perpetually angry or who continued to punish the same offense repeatedly revealed their own weakness, showing that the original transgression had wounded them more deeply than their response had wounded the offender. The display of ongoing resentment communicates that the other person still occupies space in your mind, still influences your emotional state, which is itself a form of power they retain over you. True Machiavellian strength is demonstrated by the capacity to inflict consequence and then move forward as though the matter never occurred, because the consequence itself was sufficient and requires no emotional follow-through. This return to normalcy serves multiple strategic functions that enhance rather than diminish the impact of your response. First, it demonstrates that you were not acting from emotion, but from principle, that you responded to disrespect, not because your feelings were hurt, but because certain behaviors require certain consequences in the orderly functioning of relationships and social structures. This elevates your action from personal vendetta to the enforcement of natural law, positioning you as someone who maintains standards rather than someone who nurses wounds. Second, it prevents the person you disciplined from becoming a permanent enemy, consumed with thoughts of revenge, instead offering them a path back to acceptable interaction based on their future behavior. Machiavelli understood that creating perpetual enemies is strategically inefficient when you can instead create people who have learned to respect you and who might even become useful to you in the future. The psychological effect of this behavior pattern on the person who disrespected you is profound and lasting. They experience the consequence, suffer through whatever cost you imposed, and then witness you behaving as though nothing happened, engaging with them normally or even pleasantly if circumstances require interaction. This creates a deeply unsettling cognitive experience because it confirms that you truly were not emotionally invested in the conflict, that you were operating from a different psychological space than they were. While they might have been caught up in ego or emotion when they showed disrespect, your response and subsequent behavior demonstrate that you were merely managing variables, solving a problem, establishing parameters. This realization is profoundly destabilizing because it suggests that you exist on a different plane of operation, that you are playing a different game with different rules, and that they are thoroughly outmatched in any confrontation with you, Moreover, this pattern of decisive consequence followed by normal interaction establishes you as someone who is both formidable and fair, a combination that Machiavelli identified as ideal for maintaining stable power relationships. People come to understand that you will absolutely enforce consequences for disrespect, but that you do not hold irrational grudges or seek unnecessary conflict. This makes you predictable in a way that actually enhances your power rather than diminishing it. People know that if they respect you and follow reasonable boundaries, they will experience your positive or neutral side, but if they transgress, they will experience swift and decisive consequences. This predictability allows them to regulate their own behavior around you, creating a stable equilibrium where respect flows naturally because everyone understands the cost-benefit analysis. Machiavelli would point out that this approach also preserves your energy and attention for matters that actually deserve them, rather than wasting your resources on prolonged conflicts over past offenses. The ruler who can administer justice and then immediately return focus to governing is far more effective than the ruler who becomes consumed with revenge and allows actual threats to develop while nursing old wounds. Similarly, in personal and professional contexts, the person who can establish boundaries decisively and then move forward is far more powerful and effective than the person who gets trapped in cycles of resentment and retaliation. Your capacity to respond to disrespect and then let it go completely is itself a demonstration of superior discipline and strength that others observe and incorporate into their assessment of you. This phase also serves as a test of whether your initial response was sufficient or whether further consequence is required, a diagnostic function that Machiavelli would appreciate for its strategic utility. If the person who disrespected you returns to respectful behavior after experiencing consequences and observing your return to normalcy, then your response was calibrated correctly and achieved its objective. The matter is resolved, and you have gained a person who now understands your boundaries and enforces them in their own behavior toward you. However, if the person mistakes your return to normalcy for weakness and resumes disrespectful behavior, then you have valuable information. This individual requires a more severe lesson, and you should escalate your response accordingly while still maintaining the same emotional detachment and strategic calculation. The mastery of this cycle, where consequence leads to resolution and normalcy, unless the offender proves incapable of learning, creates what Machiavelli would recognize as sustainable power. You are not exhausting yourself with constant conflict, not creating unnecessary enemies, not burning bridges that might later prove useful. Instead, you are efficiently managing human behavior through the strategic application of consequences paired with the offer of normal relations for those wise enough to adjust their behavior accordingly. This is power that reinforces itself, that becomes easier to maintain over time because people learn the patterns and adjust preemptively, that allows you to focus your actual energy on advancement and achievement rather than perpetual defense of your dignity. The next layer of Machiavellian strategy involves understanding that different types of disrespect require different forms of response, and that mechanical application of the same consequence to every offense reveals a lack of strategic thinking that ultimately undermines your authority. Machiavelli emphasized that the effective prince must be like a skilled physician who prescribes different remedies for different ailments, recognizing that context, intention, and audience all influence what response will be most effective in transforming disrespect into fear and future obedience. The person who disrespects you out of ignorance requires different handling than the person who does so deliberately to challenge your authority, just as the disrespect shown in private demands different response than the disrespect displayed before witnesses whose opinions matter to your broader objectives. When disrespect occurs in private, with no witnesses to observe either the offense or your response, Machiavelli would counsel a response focused entirely on the psychological transformation of the individual offender. Here you have an opportunity to be more direct and educational, perhaps even explaining the strategic principles you operate under and why their behavior required consequence. This might seem like showing your hand, but Machiavelli recognized that sometimes the most effective way to establish lasting respect is to demonstrate that you understand power dynamics at a level the other person has never contemplated, essentially overwhelming them with the sophistication of your thinking. A private conversation where you calmly explain that you could have responded far more severely but chose a measured consequence, and that future disrespect will result in escalation, can create profound psychological impact precisely because it reveals the iceberg beneath the surface. Conversely, when disrespect occurs publicly or before witnesses whose perceptions influence your broader authority, your response must account for the audience as much as the offender. Machiavelli understood that public challenges to authority cannot be fully resolved privately because the witnesses to the disrespect need to see that it carries consequences. Otherwise, your authority erodes in their estimation even if you have settled matters with the offender. In these situations, your response must be visible enough and decisive enough that everyone who witnessed the offense also witnesses or learns of the consequence, creating the educational example that prevents others from making the same error. This does not necessarily mean public humiliation, but it does mean ensuring that the social cost of disrespecting you becomes clear to the broader community whose opinions and behaviors you need to manage. The nature of the disrespect itself also dictates appropriate response in ways that Machiavelli would recognize as strategically important. Disrespect that stems from genuine ignorance about your position, capabilities, or boundaries can often be corrected with a firm but measured response that educates without destroying the relationship, because the person may become a valuable ally once they understand who you actually are. Machiavelli observed that turning potential enemies into supporters is often more valuable than simply neutralizing them, and that showing someone the error of their assessment of you can sometimes create loyalty born from their realization that they misjudged you, and yet you did not destroy them when you could have. This requires wisdom in distinguishing genuine ignorance from deliberate testing, a distinction that comes from the careful observation discussed in earlier phases. However, when disrespect is deliberate, when someone knows who you are and what you represent and still chooses to transgress, Machiavelli would counsel a response severe enough to make an enduring example. Deliberate challenges to authority are tests that observers watch carefully, and if you fail to respond decisively, you invite a cascade of further challenges as others sense weakness or uncertainty. The person who disrespects you with full knowledge of what they are doing is making a strategic calculation that you either cannot or will not impose meaningful consequences, and your response must shatter this calculation so completely that they never make it again, and others observing are dissuaded from making their own tests. This is where the principle of decisive, disproportionate response becomes most important, creating a cost so much greater than the momentary satisfaction of disrespect that the equation never makes sense again. Machiavelli would also distinguish between disrespect that threatens your fundamental authority and disrespect that is merely annoying or inconvenient. The former demands immediate and decisive response because allowing challenges to core authority to go unanswered creates precedents that metastasize into bigger problems. The latter might be strategically ignored if addressing it would consume resources better deployed elsewhere, or if the offender is too insignificant to warrant the energy expenditure. This is not weakness, but rather strategic prioritization, recognizing that true power involves choosing which battles to fight rather than responding mechanically to every provocation. The prince who exhausts himself swatting at every minor irritation, Machiavelli observed, has no energy left for the serious threats that determine his ultimate survival. The sophistication here lies in developing the judgment to correctly categorize each instance of disrespect and match it to the appropriate level and type of response. This requires the kind of strategic thinking that Machiavelli himself embodied. The capacity to quickly assess situations, understand underlying motivations, recognize broader implications, and select actions that achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. When you respond to ignorant disrespect with education rather than destruction, you gain a potential ally while still establishing boundaries. When you respond to deliberate challenges with overwhelming consequence, you prevent future challenges while establishing your reputation. When you ignore trivial provocations from insignificant sources, you preserve your energy and demonstrate that you cannot be baited into wasting resources on matters beneath your concern. Perhaps the most subtle but powerful Machiavellian principle in transforming disrespect into fear involves creating systems and patterns of consequence that operate with such consistency that they become self-enforcing, requiring less and less active intervention from you over time. Machiavelli understood that the most efficient form of power is power that maintains itself through the internalized understanding of those subject to it, where people regulate their own behavior because they have thoroughly learned the natural consequences of various actions. This is achieved not through random acts of severity, but through establishing predictable patterns where disrespect always, inevitably, results in consequences that are swift enough, significant enough, and consistent enough that rational people learn to avoid the triggering behavior. The establishment of this pattern requires what Machiavelli would recognize as strategic consistency in the early phases of any power relationship. When you first interact with new people, enter new environments, or assume new positions, you must be particularly vigilant about responding to disrespect because these initial interactions establish the precedents that will govern all future dynamics. The person who lets early disrespect slide, hoping to be liked or to avoid conflict, discovers that they have taught everyone around them that disrespecting them carries no cost, and reversing this lesson later becomes exponentially more difficult. Machiavelli counseled that it is better to establish yourself as formidable from the beginning and soften later if strategically appropriate than to begin as permissive and attempt to impose discipline after patterns of disrespect have been established. This means that in new situations, you should respond to even relatively minor forms of disrespect with decisive clarity, establishing the pattern that will protect you from more serious challenges later. Machiavelli observed that small transgressions unaddressed become licenses for larger ones, that the person who gets away with a minor insult will test with a major one, that the boundary not defended is the boundary that ceases to exist. By responding firmly to initial tests, you prevent the escalation that would later require even more severe responses, efficiently managing the trajectory of relationships before they develop in problematic directions. This is preventative power, the kind that appears effortless because problems are addressed before they fully materialize. As this pattern of consistent consequence becomes established, something remarkable occurs that Machiavelli described in his observations of effective rule. Other people begin to enforce your boundaries on your behalf. When everyone in an environment understands that disrespecting you results in predictable and significant consequences, bystanders will often intervene to stop someone from making that error, not out of loyalty to you, but out of desire to avoid the disruption and social awkwardness that will follow your inevitable response. This is power at its most refined, where your reputation and established patterns do most of the work while you expend minimal actual energy. The prince, whose reputation for severity is so well established that courtiers police each other's behavior toward him, Machiavelli noted, has achieved a form of governance far more efficient than the prince who must personally discipline every transgression. The maintenance of this self-reinforcing system requires occasional reminders, what Machiavelli might call the periodic refreshing of memory through example. Even in well-established power relationships, someone will eventually test the boundaries, either because they are new to the environment and do not yet understand the patterns, or because they believe time has softened your resolve, or because they are simply foolish enough to think they will be the exception. When these tests occur, your response must be immediate and decisive, not because this particular instance is necessarily important, but because everyone is watching to see whether the old patterns still hold. If you respond consistently with your established patterns, you reinforce the system and prevent erosion of your authority. If you let it slide, you create uncertainty about whether the rules have changed, inviting a cascade of testing behavior as others probe to find the new boundaries. Machiavelli would emphasize that this systematic approach to managing disrespect is ultimately more humane than the alternatives, despite appearing harsh to those unfamiliar with strategic thinking about power. The consistent enforcement of boundaries and consequences means that fewer people actually experience severe consequences, because most learn through observation and minor corrections. The environment becomes more stable and predictable for everyone because the rules are clear and consistently applied. Compare this to the chaos that emerges when someone tries to rule through inconsistent niceness, punctuated by random explosions of anger, where no one can predict what behavior will trigger consequence, and therefore everyone operates in a state of anxiety and confusion. The Machiavellian system, despite its calculation, actually creates more clarity and therefore more peace than the seemingly kinder approach of inconsistent permissiveness. The psychological impact on you yourself is also worth considering through a Machiavellian lens. When you establish these consistent patterns and maintain them through strategic discipline rather than emotional reaction, you liberate yourself from the exhausting cycle of feeling disrespected and having to manage those feelings. Disrespect becomes not a personal wound, but a mechanical trigger for a predetermined response, no more emotionally significant than any other decision you make in the course of managing your affairs. This emotional detachment is both a result and a cause of genuine power, creating a feedback loop where your lack of emotional investment in conflicts makes you more effective at managing them, which in turn strengthens your authority and reduces the frequency of challenges you face. The transition from being someone who experiences disrespect to someone who instinctively commands respect involves a transformation that Machiavelli would recognize as fundamentally psychological, occurring as much in your own mind as in the minds of those around you. This transformation requires embracing a truth that makes many people uncomfortable: that human relationships are inherently hierarchical, that every interaction involves a negotiation of relative status, and that attempting to pretend otherwise simply means you are participating in this negotiation unconsciously and usually from a position of weakness. Machiavelli's genius was in making explicit what everyone feels, but most refuse to acknowledge, giving those willing to face reality a decisive advantage over those who cling to comfortable illusions about human nature. When you begin to view interactions through this Machiavellian lens, you stop experiencing disrespect as a wound to your ego and start recognizing it as information about how others perceive you, and therefore as an opportunity to correct misperceptions through strategic action. This shift in perspective is profoundly liberating because it removes the emotional sting from disrespect while preserving and actually enhancing your capacity to respond effectively. The person caught in ego feels disrespected and becomes angry or hurt, their judgment clouded by emotion, and their response is reactive and often counterproductive. The person operating from Machiavellian understanding sees disrespect and thinks strategically about what it reveals and what response will most effectively reshape the dynamic. Their judgment clear and their response is precisely calibrated to achieve desired outcomes. This psychological transformation also involves accepting that being liked and being respected are not the same thing, and that in situations where you must choose between them, respect is the more valuable currency. Machiavelli observed that the prince who tries to be loved by everyone ends up respected by no one, his attempts to please creating only contempt as others recognize his neediness and exploit it. The prince who accepts that he cannot please everyone and instead ensures that everyone respects him, even if some dislike him, builds a foundation of power that persists regardless of others' emotional states toward him. This applies equally in modern contexts. The manager, desperate to be liked by subordinates, struggles to enforce standards and loses authority, while the manager who prioritizes respect over affection maintains order and accomplishes objectives even if not everyone enjoys the process. The cultivation of this mindset requires deliberate practice and often goes against social conditioning that taught you to seek approval and avoid conflict. Machiavelli would acknowledge that this is difficult, that most people will never achieve this psychological transformation because it requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature and about yourself. But for those willing to do the internal work, the rewards are substantial. A form of personal power that does not depend on others' moods or opinions, relationships based on clear mutual understanding rather than unspoken resentments, and the capacity to shape your social environment rather than being passively shaped by it. You move from being someone to whom things happen to being someone who makes things happen, from someone others test and push to someone others approach with caution and respect. Part of this transformation involves developing what Machiavelli might call strategic cruelty, though this term requires careful understanding to avoid misapplication. Strategic cruelty does not mean sadism or unnecessary harm, but rather the willingness to impose costs on others when necessary to establish or maintain proper order, even when doing so makes you momentarily unpopular or causes you some personal discomfort. Many people fail to effectively respond to disrespect, not because they lack the power to do so, but because they lack the stomach for being temporarily seen as harsh or mean. Machiavelli observed that this squeamishness about being the enforcer of consequences is itself a form of weakness that others sense and exploit, and that overcoming it is essential to exercising power effectively. The development of strategic cruelty involves training yourself to separate the action you need to take from your feelings about taking it, executing necessary consequences with the same emotional neutrality you would bring to any other administrative task. When someone requires discipline for disrespect, you impose it not with anger or pleasure, but with the calm recognition that this is what the situation requires. Much as a surgeon might perform an amputation not with enjoyment, but with the understanding that it is necessary to preserve the patient's life. Machiavelli would recognize this capacity for necessary harshness without emotional investment as one of the key traits separating those destined to wield power from those destined to be subject to it. This entire psychological transformation culminates in what might be called the Machiavellian presence, an aura or bearing that communicates capability and danger without any explicit threat, that causes people to naturally regulate their behavior around you without your having to actively enforce boundaries in every interaction. This presence is not something you can fake or perform. It emerges authentically from the internal transformation of how you view yourself and others, from the patterns you have established through consistent action. and from the reputation you have built through strategic responses to challenges. When this presence is fully developed, disrespect becomes increasingly rare because people instinctively sense that you are not someone to be trifled with. Their unconscious social calibration systems recognizing signals of dominance and capability that they cannot articulate but nonetheless respond to automatically. The ultimate sophistication in the Machiavellian transformation of disrespect into fear and obedience involves transcending the need for external validation entirely, reaching a state where your sense of your own worth and authority is so internally anchored that others' attempts at disrespect seem almost absurd, like children throwing pebbles at a fortress. Machiavelli himself embodied this quality in his later years, continuing to write and think and advise with undiminished brilliance, even after being tortured and exiled by the very Medici family he later counseled. Because his sense of his own value and understanding was not dependent on external recognition, this is the final level of power, not needing others to respect you in order to know your worth, while simultaneously possessing the skills to compel their respect when strategically necessary. At this level of development, your responses to disrespect become almost playful, executed with a kind of detached amusement at the transparency of others' moves and the predictability of human behavior. You respond not because your feelings are hurt or your ego wounded, but because maintaining certain standards serves your broader strategic interests, and because allowing disrespect to pass unaddressed creates management problems you would prefer to avoid. The emotional charge has been completely removed from the equation, replaced by pure strategic calculation about costs and benefits, about what actions will produce what results, about how to most efficiently maintain the social order that serves your purposes. Machiavelli would recognize this state as the apex of political and social mastery, where you have become like the grandmaster playing chess against novices, able to see so many moves ahead that the game's outcome is never really in doubt. This does not mean you become cold or inhuman in your interactions. In fact, Machiavelli would observe that the person who has achieved this level of mastery often becomes more genuinely warm and generous in their normal interactions, precisely because they are not constantly defending their ego or proving their worth. When you know with absolute certainty that you can impose your will when necessary, you no longer need to posture or perform dominance in every interaction. You can afford to be kind, to be generous, to let small things slide because you are operating from a position of such fundamental security that minor provocations truly do not register as threats. This selective softness from a position of strength is far more powerful than constant harshness from insecurity, because it demonstrates that your power is real enough to be deployed selectively rather than desperately. The mastery also involves recognizing when strategic withdrawal or apparent submission actually serves your purposes better than confrontation. A sophisticated move that Machiavelli discussed in his analysis of how the weak can sometimes outmaneuver the strong through clever positioning. There are situations where allowing someone to believe they have disrespected you successfully serves your larger strategy. Perhaps because it causes them to underestimate you in ways you can exploit later, or because maintaining their goodwill provides access to resources or information you need, or because their disrespect reveals their character to others in ways that damage them more than any response from you could. The person who has truly mastered Machiavellian principles knows when to enforce respect and when to strategically absorb disrespect, making either choice deliberately rather than being forced into it by pride or fear. Consider how this principle operates in complex social or professional environments where multiple players and competing interests create intricate webs of relationships and dependencies. The person operating at this level of sophistication might allow a rival to publicly disrespect them, if doing so causes that rival to overplay their hand and lose the support of powerful figures who value decorum, or if it creates an opportunity for the disrespected person to respond later in a way that appears reluctant and therefore gains them sympathy rather than appearing petty. Machiavelli's writings are full of examples where the most effective move was not the obvious aggressive response, but rather a counterintuitive strategic positioning that turned apparent weakness into actual strength. This level of play is only available to those who have transcended ego and operate purely from strategic calculation. The person who reaches this level of mastery also develops the capacity to teach others the Machiavellian principles, not through explicit instruction, but through the modeling of effective power in action. Your consistency, your strategic thinking, your emotional discipline, and your effective responses to challenges become a kind of curriculum that others study consciously or unconsciously, learning from your example how power actually functions beneath the polite fictions of social interaction. Some will learn these lessons and become more formidable themselves, which Machiavelli would view as acceptable since the world benefits from having more people who understand reality rather than operating from illusion. Others will learn just enough to recognize that you are operating at a level beyond their current capacity, which creates the respect and caution that make your life easier. The final insight at this level involves recognizing that all of these strategies and techniques are ultimately in service of freedom, specifically your freedom to pursue your objectives without being constantly derailed by others' disrespect, challenges, or attempts to subordinate you to their purposes. Machiavelli wrote, "The prince, not to create tyrants, but to provide practical guidance for maintaining power in a world of competing interests and hostile forces, recognizing that those who fail to understand power are doomed to be its victims rather than its wielders." Similarly, the personal mastery of these principles liberates you from the exhausting dynamics of constant social combat, allowing you to focus your energy on creation, achievement, and the pursuit of goals that actually matter to you rather than perpetual defense of your position and dignity. This freedom extends even to the freedom to eventually transcend the game itself if you choose, to reach a level of accomplishment or self-sufficiency where others' opinions and behaviors have minimal impact on your actual life outcomes. Machiavelli himself achieved this in some sense through his writing, creating works that would educate and influence centuries of readers long after the petty political figures who disrespected and exiled him had been forgotten by history. The ultimate transformation of disrespect into fear, then, might be the transformation of all external power dynamics into irrelevance compared to the power you have cultivated within yourself. The power of understanding, of discipline, of strategic thinking, and of the wisdom to know when to fight and when to simply continue building something more lasting than any individual conflict could ever be. The transformation from someone who suffers disrespect to someone who commands automatic deference is not a single moment, but rather an ongoing process of internal development and external demonstration, a gradual accumulation of patterns and responses that eventually crystallize into a reputation and presence that precede you into every new interaction. Machiavelli understood that power is not something you possess in a fixed quantity, but rather something you continuously create through strategic action, through the alignment of your behavior with principles that have governed human social dynamics since the beginning of recorded history. What appears to others as natural authority or innate charisma is actually the visible manifestation of countless micro-decisions to respond strategically rather than emotionally, to enforce standards consistently rather than sporadically, to think several moves ahead rather than simply reacting to immediate circumstances. The journey requires confronting truths about human nature that many find uncomfortable, that people respect power more readily than goodness, that clear enforcement of boundaries creates more stable relationships than permissiveness, that strategic calculation often achieves better outcomes than emotional authenticity, and that the appearance of effortless dominance is actually the result of tremendous internal discipline. Machiavelli offered these insights not to corrupt the innocent, but to arm the capable with understanding that allows them to navigate a world that operates according to these principles, whether we acknowledge them or not. The choice is not whether to participate in power dynamics, since participation is inevitable whenever humans interact, but rather whether to participate consciously and skillfully, or unconsciously and ineffectively. Throughout this exploration, the consistent thread has been that transforming disrespect into fear and obedience is fundamentally an exercise in strategic psychology, in understanding how humans assess each other and adjust their behavior based on observed consequences. Every instance of disrespect you encounter is an opportunity to provide education through demonstration, showing the person and all observers what happens when your boundaries are crossed, what costs attach to challenging your authority, and what standards you maintain, regardless of whether others initially recognize them. The accumulation of these demonstrations over time builds a reputation that eventually does most of the work for you, as people preemptively adjust their behavior based on what they have witnessed or heard about how you respond to transgression. The power of the Machiavellian approach lies not in cruelty, but in clarity, not in domination for its own sake, but in the efficient establishment of mutually understood parameters that allow relationships and endeavors to function smoothly. When everyone understands what behavior is acceptable and what consequences follow from unacceptable behavior, a kind of peace emerges that benefits all parties, even if it initially feels uncomfortable to those accustomed to chaos and unpredictability. You are not seeking to terrorize, but rather to educate, not to create enemies, but to create a social environment where your authority is recognized and respected, freeing you to focus on objectives that matter rather than constant defense of your position. As you move forward from this understanding, the question becomes not whether you will face disrespect, but whether you will continue to absorb it passively or finally step into the role that Machiavelli outlined 5 centuries ago. The role of the strategist who sees clearly, acts decisively, and shapes social dynamics rather than being shaped by them. The tools and principles are now yours to apply, to test against reality, to refine through practice until they become second nature, and the transformation from disrespected to feared becomes not something you strive for, but something you have already become. The real power of this knowledge reveals itself not in the moment you finish consuming it, but in the countless future moments where you face disrespect and choose strategic mastery over reactive emotion, each choice strengthening the pattern until your authority becomes unquestionable. If these insights have resonated with the part of you that recognizes truth even when it conflicts with comfortable beliefs, if you have glimpsed the possibility of moving through the world with the strategic clarity that Machiavelli himself possessed, then this is not an ending, but a beginning of a different kind of existence. Share this knowledge with others who struggle under the weight of disrespect they do not know how to transform, who could benefit from understanding that power is not a birthright, but a skill that can be developed through study and practice. Subscribe to continue exploring these principles that govern human interaction beneath the surface of polite pretense. And leave a comment sharing which Machiavellian insight struck you most powerfully, which element of this transformation you are most eager to implement in your own life. The conversation continues beyond this video, in the application of these ideas to real situations, in the community of those who have chosen to see clearly rather than comfortably, and in your own journey from being subject to being sovereign in your own existence.